الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So we'll be discussing the book Talkhis Nukhbatul Fikr by one of the Mashaykh of Mu'asir, who had made a talkhis, a summary of the book of Nukhbatul Fikr by Hafid ibn Hajar Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala. So this book is a well-known book in the topic on the subject of Ilm al-Hadith, Mustalah al-Hadith, and we have covered different points on this matter. And in the last session that we had ended the discussion regarding Hadith Sahih and those masail, or some of those masail, some of those topics that relates to the Hadith Sahih. So today, inshallah ta'ala, we'll be picking up by now discussing another class of Hadith with Hadith, al-Naw' al-Thani, which is said to be Hadith al-Hasan. So we'll be discussing regarding Hadith al-Hasan and some of what is mentioned regarding this particular topic. So as for what is mentioned here by the author of this talkhis, as he discussed now the second type of Hadith, we mention al-Hadith al-Hasan. So we'll be discussing Hadith al-Hasan, then he mentioned أقسامه لذاته وَلِغَيْرِ, that it falls into two categories. So the first of those things that we'll cover regarding Hadith al-Hasan, that what is said regarding what is al-Hasan, istilahan. So Hadith al-Hasan, the word Hasan, the ulama mentioned that it can have meanings. Of those meaning, Jamil or Jamal, something which is said to be beautify or good. So that's the meaning of Hasan, something which is Jamil. And also they mentioned that al-Jamil also could mean Did al-Kabih. So, or Hasan, that it is something which is opposite, something which is said to be ugly and unbefitting. So that's the meaning linguistically of the word Hasan. As for this term is used when concerned the ulama of Hadith, that is used in a particular way. So they have the ulama of Hadith have used the word Hadith al-Hasan to have a particular meaning. And as he mentioned here, that Hasan, Hadith al-Hasan, it falls into two categories. The first category, they refer to a Hadith Hasan li-dhati, and the second, al-Hadith Hasan li-ghayri. So those are the two categories of Hadith al-Hasan. So as for the first, that is mentioned as what is defined here, istilahan, according to the ulama of Hadith, they mentioned that, as mentioned by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that he mentioned, ma rawahu adlun خفيف الضبط متصل السند من غير شذوذ ولا إلة. So he mentioned that what is meant by Hadith al-Hasan based upon what is mentioned by Ibn Hajar in his book Nukhbatul Fikr. So Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, that he defined what he mentioned as the meaning of Hadith al-Hasan. He states that it is ma rawahu adlun, that is narrated by someone who is said to be adl, a person who is reliable, credible, khafif al-dabt, that the person, he has some a lesser degree in his dabt, so of a lesser degree in his dabt, in his memory. Muttasil as-sanad, it has a continuous chain, then a connected chains, min ghayri shudud wala illa, and also the hadith, it is free from any form of shudud or illa, anything which is odd, abnormal, and also nothing that he mentioned, illa, and nothing of hidden defects. So this is a Hadith Hasan. So this definition, it will fall upon what is said to be Hadith al-Hasan li-dhati. Hadith al-Hasan li-dhatihi. So bear in mind, so that's the definition given by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala. And this definition is the one that becomes now the standard definition that is used in defining what is said to be Hadith al-Hasan. So the definition given by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala is of those that said to be the standard that is used in defining Hadith al-Hasan, or the more the more established definition put forward in defining Hadith al-Hasan. This is the one mentioned by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala. Bear in mind that Hadith al-Hasan, you have many of the ulama before who preceded Ibn Hajar that have given a definition. So we have of the first of those who have given, so you find the books of Mustalah or Ilm al-Hadith that goes in detail, that they mention other definition, and the first of those who have given a definition of Hadith al-Hasan that they mention, who is at-Tirmidhi, Abu Isa At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala have given a definition of hadith al-Hasan, as he mentioned in his book. So he mentioned his definition, that he mentioned his definition, then also after him, and that definition given by At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, you find some ulama have somewhat of challenged that definition and finding not to be one which is maybe as precise. But even though some mention it is more, it is more of a definition that goes back to hadith Hasan li ghayri, the next type. But then after we find others who have given definition of hadith al-Hasan. We have Khattabi, who have given a definition of hadith al-Hasan, and also the ulama that they have some contention, some observation regarding the definition of both At-Tirmidhi and also of the definition of Khattabi. Then after you find others who have given definition of hadith al-Hasan. The third in that line would be Ibn Jawzi. So Ibn Jawzi rahimahullah ta'ala that also put forward a definition of hadith al-Hasan. And again, that also you have some criticism of that definition between the ulama. Then you have Ibn Salah, who have also put forward a definition of hadith al-Hasan, and also others who have put forward. We have Ibn Salah being al-Dhahabi, also have given a definition of hadith al-Hasan, and also Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, So we have mentioned over 6 of the ulama, and others who have put forward what they deem to be what is the definition of hadith al-Hasan. Most of those are somewhat disputed regarding how precise they are in their definition, including that of Ibn Hajar. So even of those who have criticized the definition of Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah regarding what he defined as hadith al-Hasan, where you find that Amir al-San'ani have criticized, and others where they mentioned that when they mention khafif al-dabt, that they mention ghayr mundabit. It's not something which is very is somewhat, they mention that it's not something which is that's clearly defined as to what he intends by khafif al-dabt. It's not really measured or defined as to what it is. So they mentioned that it is not. Also, they criticize this definition there, this definition of hadith al-Hasan by Ibn Hajar, and also all and others. So that's concerned that discussion regarding that meaning of hadith al-Hasan. The second definition that is given regarding hadith al-Hasan li ghayri. So I mentioned first hadith Hasan li dhatihi, and that it has 5 conditions. So the condition of that are 5. All 5 they mention ittisal sanad. Second, dabt, mentioned adalatul riwat, that all of them have to be credible. So that also agree with hadith sahih. Third, adam ashudud, that there doesn't anything which is that contradicts. And the other, fourth, is adam al-illa, nothing which is hidden defect. And the fifth, which is where they differ, which is khafif al-dabt. Khafif al-dabt. So khafif al-dabt is now the area where hadith al-Hasan and hadith al-Sahih that they differ. They differ on the area, in the area of dabt. So hadith al-Sahih tam al-dabt, wal hadith al-Hasan khafif al-dabt. So one is of a higher level and the one which is of a lesser level in his dabt. But that level of dabt is still one which is acceptable. Is still maqbool. So his level of memory is not as high, but it is still that which is said to be maqbool, which is acceptable, where the person is said to be complete daif. So that's concerning the difference between hadith sahih and hadith al-Hasan li dhatihi. Then I mentioned the second definition that the author mentioned, al-hadith al-Hasan li ghayrihi huwa al-hadith alladhi تعددت طرق التي فيها الضعف يصير منجبر. So that's what he mentioned as the second category of hadith al-Hasan. Hadith Hasan لغير hadith al-Hasan by through other support, by supporting hadith or ways. So they mentioned that it was hadith الذي تعددت طرق hadith that comes with many different chains or shawahid, but they have weakness. They have a degree of weakness, but the weakness is slight, where if they are placed together, they give strength. So these hadith, multiple hadith, narrations that are multiple, all of which have weakness, but when they're added together, combined together, because all discussing the same matter, but they all have weakness. But when they are put together, then they give strength to each other, because the weakness is a slight weakness, is not complete dismissal, or weakness is said to be weakness which is shadid. So they are slight, dafin yasir, munjabar, where they can be supported by other narration and give strength. So those are definitions are given, that the two definitions are mentioned regarding hadith. Al-Hasan li-dhatihi is Hasan on its own, and also hadith Al-Hasan li-ghayri. So those are the definitions that are mentioned by both. Some mentioned also of the thing regarding definition, I was mentioning with the hadith, that certain things are still there. With hadith ad-daif, that there's some weakness in the narrator. So example of cases of hadith, and putting in context what is said to be khafif ad-dabt. So they mentioned that who will fall in that category of khafif ad-dabt. They mention a person to be thika, lahu awham. A narrator who said to be la bas bihi. So a narrator who said to be la bas bihi is okay. He will fall in the category of hadith al-hasan. The person said to be thika, lahu awham, that a person to be thika but he has some errors. Or thika yukhti, that he said to be a thika but he makes some errors. So these are the category sayyul if, thika sayyul if, but he said to be thika but he have weak memory. Then these are said to be hadith, the person who said to be of the category of hadith al-hasan. That will be of the category said to be of the person said to be hadith al-hasan. And in the second category, hadith, where the person said to be daif. Daif, but daif concerning jahala. Daif of hadith hasan li ghayri, that there's weakness by way of inqita. Mursal. So these are cases where that the weakness is slight, mudallis, in some degree, that their hadith are said to be daif. But there's a possibility it could be supported and strengthened by other hadith that are similar on the same topic, and elevated to hadith which is said to be hasan, because there's a weakness but not very severe, not a severe weakness. So severe muttahim bil kadhib, makdhub, these are cases that will be said to be severe weaknesses. So that's concerning the next matter regarding hadith. So we have mentioned that Yavir ulama who have put forward regarding definition of hadith to sahih. Next matter to be covered, as we mentioned, that hadith al-hasan, that is classed as hadith which is said to be maqbool, within the category of hadith that are said to be maqbool. But before we go to that a point that someone mentioned, that Ibn Hajar rahimahullah have gave this definition of hadith hasan, as we had mentioned, the definition by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, ittisal al-sanad, complete connected chain, adalatul rawat, that narrators are said to be reliable, trustworthy. Third, with hadith al-hasan, khafif ad-dabt, that they have a slight weakness in their dabt, but they have memory, but it is a slight less level of that of sahih. Adam ash-shudud, there's no oddness with the hadith. And fifth, that there's adam al-illah, that there's nothing of hidden defects within the hadith. So those are the hadith that are said to be hadith, that are said to be hasan with Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala. And his definition was said, and that's the standard, that definition that is now used up until today as defining hadith al-hasan. They mentioned there is another definition that is there, but is written by of those who made that I mentioned by Taqiyuddin Shumunni. So Taqiyuddin Shumunni, that when he defined Hadith al-Hasan, so he mentioned that Hadith al-Hasan, he state, Khabarun Mu'tasil is Hadith that is Muttasil of a continuous chain, connected chain. Qillat Dabt, slight Dabt, Rawihi Al-Adl, so slight weakness in the, again, Khafif al-Dabt, Qillat al-Dabt, Rawihi Adl, the narrator said to be reliable. Wartafa and Hal, where they said, the narrator that they are Murtafa and Hal man yu'ad ma yunfarid bihi munkar, that they have the narrator that of Adala, but they are above those that are said to be of those that if they say anything on their own accord, they have isolated case of narration, single narration by themselves, then considered to be munkar, it is rejected. They are free from this. Then he mentioned walaysa bishad wala illa, and also wala mu'all, it is not said to be shad wala mu'all. So that's the definition given by Shumunni. That is somewhat, some mentioned that that's also a definition that is to be considered. A definition that to be considered that run par to par, or maybe more precise than that given by Ibn Hajar, but is of those definition that is also an equal par or slightly equal to that of the definition given by Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, but the definition of Shumunni is not as widespread. So it is not as widespread, but that's a definition that also that is to be given some attention. They mentioned also regarding Hadith al-Sahih or Hadith al-Sari, Hadith al-Hasan, that I mentioned that ittasil sanad, that it doesn't mean maybe one individual in the isnad that is of a lesser level in his dabt. So you might have that everyone in the isnad is of the level of tamam al-dabt, of a high level, a high standard in their memory and recollection and their memory of the hadith, of how they memorize the hadith. But you might find one person that is of a slight lower level than they are, but still acceptable. So it doesn't mean that all the narrators said to be of a lower level, but maybe just one person on one level, he is the one that without weakness. So that he will not be said to be Sahih, but be said to be Hasan, because in the tabaqat, one person in one level is of a medium level. We just use the word as medium level of acceptance, not to the highest level. So the hadith will not be graded as Sahih, will be graded as Hasan, unless there's another hadith that is similar to it that will elevate it to Sahih li ghayri, that will elevate it to Sahih li ghayri. If there's another narration similar or other turuq or other shawahid, then it will be elevated to Hadithu Sahih li ghayri. But that hadith, so that's I think the point. So it doesn't mean that all the narrators are of a medium level. You have majority could be of the high level, but maybe one of the narrator is of a medium level. That is khafif al-dabt. So the hadith will be graded as Hasan because of that narrator of a lesser level compared to other narrators. So what is meant by Ibn Hajar, it doesn't mean that all the narrators are of that level of khafif al-dabt. Not all the narrators are said to be of khafif al-dabt. Another way also that some have mentioned regarding hadith, that hadith that is said to be hadith Hasan li ghayri, what enter into this, we said munjabar, where hadith alladhi fi sanadi. So hadith li ghayri, Hasan li ghayri, is where hadith alladhi fi sanadi, hadith in the isnad, rawin daif, a narrator which is weak. So in isnad, of all the narrator, maybe one of them is said to be daif, maybe one. Then that will now have a bearing on the ruling, the grading placed on the hadith, because of maybe one narrator. So the hadith is considered to be, so it would, that one narrator will have a bearing on the final judgment of the hadith, even though you have everyone else is thiqat. So they mentioned that rawin daif, natija لسوء الحفظ, where the person maybe have a slight poorness in his memory, or tadlis, their level of tadlis that are involved in the isnad by some narrator, or jahala, or a person said to be unknown, or kana hadith mursal, or the hadith is said to be mursal, as we'll discuss these terms, or munqata, to be discussed a breakage in the isnad, thumma tuba, but there's other narrations that support this hadith, other narration that coincide with this narration that will give it some degree of strength, depending on the level of strength of the hadith itself also. So that's concerning hadith al-Hasan. Also of the points that you mentioned regarding, as for the point of hadith al-Hasan, that they mentioned that the word Hasan, hadith al-Hasan, of aqsam, as we mentioned. Hadith Hasan li dhati, and the second type is hadith Hasan li ghayri. So they have two levels. They have two levels. The next of those matters, so they mentioned hadith Hasan li ghayri, Hasan li dhati, hadith Hasan li dhatihi, wal hadith Hasan li ghayri. As for dhatihi, they mention example that they mentioned the hadith of Baz ibn Hakim and Abihi and Jaddihi, wa Amr ibn Shuhaib and Abihi and Jaddihi, or they mentioned the case of the cases of example that they mentioned Muhammad ibn Amr and Abi Salama and Abi Hurairah. These are example, or wa Ibrahim, or Ibn Ibrahim and Muhammad Ibrahim at-Taymi and the likes. So these are said to be example of hadith chains that are said to be of the level of Hasan hadith. Hasan hadith, Hasan lidati'i. So they mention these are some of those examples. So I said the examples of those would be those type of isnad, Baz ibn Hakim and Abihi and Jaddihi, or another Amr ibn Shuhaib and Abihi and Jaddihi. Or it could be the case of Muhammad ibn Amr and Abi Salama and Abi Hurairah. These are example of isnad that are graded as Hasan. When you see that type of isnad or that type of chain, then it's said to be of the level of Hasan. They are level of Hasan, or unless there's other factors. Unless there are other factors. As for the term Hadith al-Hasan, that as what have been now established between the ulama of hadith and the ulama in general, that hadith is of three categories. That hadith yanqasim ila thalath al-aqsam. That hadith, it is categorized, divided into three main category or branches. Hadith al-Sahih, and we have covered this. Hadith al-Hasan, we're covering this topic at present. And what will follow will hadith al-Daif. So hadith are in those three categories. Those three categories. Sahih, of the highest level. Hasan, of a middle level that is considered to be still acceptable. And the third, Daif, which is on the level of rejected. So as for those two first levels, Hadith al-Sahih and Hadith al-Hasan, they are referred to as being Maqbul. They are said to be Hadith al-Maqbul. So they are referred to Hadith al-Maqbul. That's what is they refer to. They are classed as Hadith al-Maqbul, which is Sahih wal-Hasan. As for those two categories of Hadith al-Sahih and Hadith al-Hasan, by way of the mention that, by way of Hujjiyah, as a proof, both Hadith al-Sahih and Hadith Hasan is considered to be Hujjah, can be used as an authority on Islamic matters. So to be used as a proof, it's an hadith if it is graded as Hasan, as I mentioned, most hadith Hasan li dhatihi, then it is said to be an evidence, just as Sahih. So it can be used to establish Islamic law. It can be used to establish matters related to Aqidah. can be used as a proof regarding any matters of Islam. So hadith Hasan is also used and said to be an authority in establishing proof as a proof in Islam. As a proof in Islam. And that is mentioned by the ulama, ittifaq. They mentioned this an ittifaq. And even Hajar rahimahullah mentioned that if ittifaq regarding hadith Hasan, what is meant by lidhatihi. And a khilaf regarding, he mentioned a khilaf regarding hadith al-Hasan lighayri. But overall, hadith al-Hasan of that category of ruling or judgment on hadith, that they also are used as an evidence. So regarding matters of aqidah, matters regarding halal and haram, matters regarding akhlaq wal suluk, so matters regarding Islam, these hadith can be, hadith Hasan as a grading can be used as a proof, and it's an authority in Islam and should be accepted. Next, regarding, so is a proof in Islam. The next of those matters, who of the ulama, the first of the ulama to mention the word Hasan in the istilahan. They mention of the first of those who made it, somewhat not the first to use it, but of the early ones to make it more popular and they use it more frequent. So of the ulama who use the term Hasan as a judgment on hadith, they mention of the early ones who kind of somewhat use it frequently a lot and become widespread from them is Imam Abu al-Isa at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala. So Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala is the one in his book, they mention Al-Jami' or Sunan at-Tirmidhi, that is the one who used this term Hasan or past judgment on hadith as being Hasan in his book a lot compared to others. So of the one who can make this word hadith Hasan more popular or become known, it is Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala in his Al-Jami' as it is known and exam. So the older one, and also they mentioned that within his book that also Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, that he categorized hadith as sahih, Hasan, gharib, daif. So you put those type of grading on hadith sahih, Hasan, gharib, daif, and the likes. So he popularized the term, but as for the word hadith al-Hasan being used by the ulama of the past before him or during his time, did others of the ulama would use the word Hasan as a grading for hadith, meaning istilahan. Was this present? And the reason for this that you find out of the ulama like Al-Hakim, Ibn Khuzaymah, when they use the word hadith sahih, they also yandarij also what was included in it, hadith al-Hasan. So some of the ulama, when they use the word of past, that when they use the word hadith sahih, this also would include hadith Hasan. And of those likes, Hakim, also Ibn Khuzaymah, that when they use the word grade hadith as sahih, also sometimes the hadith as-sahih, I mean by hadith as-sahih, what is referred to as hadith al-Hasan by others. So they make they will see sahih would include Hasan, according to some of the ulama. So you find that, but of the ulama who did use the word Hasan, and they meant Hasan istilahan, a level less than sahih. So they mention of those who can somewhat use the word Hasan in their vocabulary, istilahan, Imam Malik, Ali ibn Madini, also they mentioned, and others who use the word Hasan and having a particular meaning istilahan, that it means that a grading of hadith of a level of acceptability. So hadith Hasan is acceptability of being accepted. Then I mentioned also at times the word Hasan of the ulama of the past, kibar ulama of hadith of the past, the early ulama, that sometimes use the word hadith al-Hasan and they intend by it not istilahan. So at times they use the word hadith al-Hasan, but they do not mean a level of, they do not mean istilah, mean hadith is acceptable. They mean something else. Could be linguistic, or as they mentioned, regarding concern, it could mean also ma'ani, nakara, or arad. Could mean that the hadith of some, the hadith is rejected. So at times they use the word hadith Hasan or Hasan, and they mean that the hadith is rejected. And they mention an example of this. They mention Anna Umayyah ibn Khalid قال قلت لشعبة أمية ibn Khalid قال قلت لشعبة ما لك لا تحدث عن عبد الملك ibn Abi Sulaiman. Why is it you do not narrate from this person Abdul Malik ibn Abi Sulaiman? قال تركت حديثه, that I abandon, I leave his hadith. قال قلت, then I said تحدث عن فلان وتدع عبد الملك ibn Abi Sulaiman. So then Umayyah ibn Khalid mentioned again that you have left away such person, that you have narrated tahaddith and fulan, you have narrated on such person, but you have left away Abdul Malik ibn Abi Sulaiman. قال تركته, that I have left him, dismissed him. قلت إنه, they mentioned that why. قلت إنه كان حسن الحديث, and it says, no, I said, but he's حسن الحديث. قال من حسنها فروت. They mentioned the person says, no, his hadith is Hasan. They mentioned من حسنها فررت. From its husn, I fled. Meaning that, I rejected his hadith. So in this case, concerning that, the word Hasan, meaning concerning that, meaning something that, that he fled. So at times, the word Hasan being used, one have to take into consideration in what context is being used by that alim of the ulama of the past. So the word Hasan, at times to pay attention that as to the ulama of the early times, as to what they actually intend by the word Al-Hasan. At times could be one which is indicating the hadith is acceptable, and at times it could be otherwise. Next of those things regarding Hadith al-Hasan, Madhan Hadith al-Hasan. So where the sources are books, is there books that concentrate mainly on gathering hadith which is Hasan? Or what are some of the books that we can use as a reference in finding hadith that are said to be Hasan? So some of those reference they mention, of those reference is the book of Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala, Al-Jami' or As-Sunan. So the book of Abu Isa at-Tirmidhi and the other books of As-Sunan. So Al-Jami' at-Tirmidhi, Sunan Abu Dawood, you find hadith in those books, many hadith. You find that you will find hadith which is graded as, that are considered and graded as Hasan in those books. Abu Dawood in his Sunan, Jami' at-Tirmidhi, you will find hadith that are said to be Hasan within those books. They mentioned that Manawi rahimahullah ta'ala mentioned, قال النووي كابن صلاح, that Kitab at-Tirmidhi أصل في معرفة al-Hasan, that the book of at-Tirmidhi is like the main book that to mention hadith that are said to be Hasan, of the main source that discusses and pass judgment on hadith that are said to be Hasan. So you find at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala that he uses mustalahat regarding various mustalahat he mentioned regarding indicating hadith. He mentioned at times using different terminologies. He used the word as-Sahih al-Gharib, Hasan al-Sahih, and you find some of these between the ulama of hadith have a lengthy discussion regarding what is actually meant by at-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala when he sometimes uses these words Hasan al-Sahih, especially concerning hadithun Hasanun Sahih. What does he mean by this? Hasanun Gharib, Hasanun Sahih, Gharib, min hadha wajh. So he can somewhat use these terminologies in his book, indicating hadith Sahih and also using the term Hasan. The next of those things regarding hadith al-Hasan will mention examples. We'll mention example. So they mention regarding concerning examples. So example of those hadith said to be Hasan, where they mentioned the hadith of the Prophet alayhi salam, hadith Salman al-Farisi radiyallahu anhu, أن رسول الله عليه الصلاة والسلام قال لا يرد القضاء إلا دواء ولا يزيد في العمر إلا البر. والحديث عند الترمذي وبزار. They mention concerning this particular hadith that they mentioned. The Prophet ﷺ said in hadith, لا يرد القضاء إلا الدعاء, that nothing blocks, nothing changes al-qada except for dua. So nothing alters, changes al-qada, those things which have been decreed, except for a dua. ولا يزيد في العمر, and the person does not increase in his lifespan إلا البر, except for piety. We said the hadith in that Tirmidhi and also Bazar. They mention concerning this particular hadith with this isnad that they mention بهذا إسناد ضعيف لأن من رواية أبي مودود أو مودود البصري, أبي مودود البصري واسمه فضة, that mentioned that فقد ضعفه, and this person that is said to be ضعيف, that ulama ضعفه. But I mentioned that, so the hadith is said to be ضعيف because of that narrator. But I mentioned that ولكن there's another hadith of hadith of Thawban, so we have the hadith of Salman al-Farisi that we have mentioned. There's weakness because of Abi or Abu Mawdud al-Basri. Then another narration that narrated by another Sahabi, Thawban, قال رسول الله عليه السلام لا يرد القدر, that qadr is not changed, altered, إلا dua, except by a dua. ولا يزيد في العمر, and one does not increase in lifespan إلا البر, except for البر. Al-Hadith. Now, so that part of the hadith continue, but as for the hadith, that mentioned that part, that section of hadith, that it coincide with the hadith of Salman al-Farisi, and I mentioned that this particular hadith of Thawban, that also in the Ahmad or Ibn Majah, that they mention also that there's some weakness in this isnad, based upon another narrator in the hadith of Thawban, who's Abdullah ibn Abi Ja'd. Abdullah ibn Abi Ja'd, also he said to be weak, but the weakness is not that severe. The weakness is not that severe. When I mentioned if both hadith now combined together, they give strength to each other, so both hadith will be considered to be, up to the hadith to consider to be Hasan. Hadith to consider to be Hasan, because, so that's concerning how they look at hadith regarding saying hadith is Hasan. So that's example regarding hadith So those are examples regarding Hadith al-Hasan, and we mentioned that Tim rahimahullah ta'ala, of those who somewhat have discussed this in his book a lot, in grading Hadith as Hasan. So one read that book, one will find this a lot in that book, but overall concerned that, but there's, to my knowledge, Allahu Alam, to my knowledge, that no one have combined or wrote a book that only consists of hadith that are considered to be within the grading of Hasan. Not Sahih, not Daif, but Hasan. So we mentioned that the ulama somewhat have been established that hadith is of three categories. Sahih, and we mentioned there's books that the ulama mentioned only in those books hadith would said to be Sahih. And also, as for books that are also books that will discuss, books that only mention hadith which is said to be Hasan, to my knowledge I do not know of a book of that type. For myself, I do not know of a book of that type, that the person, the author, only tried to gather hadith that are said to be Hasan. So that's concerning some of what is mentioned regarding hadith al-Hasan. So we mentioned that it is by way of grading, is considered to be below that of Sahih. It's also considered to be within the catchment of those hadith that are said to be Maqbul. Whether hadith is said Hasan is of those that category said to be still acceptable, and based upon this, it can be used as a proof. It can be used as a proof. So at times, Hadith al-Hasan, it's Hasan on his own accord with a slight weakness in the dabt of the narrator. But also, you might find at times the Hadith itself is weak, but weak, yasir, daf, yasir, munjabir, where the Hadith is weak, have some weakness in it, but it can be supported and strengthened by another similar Hadith on the same topic. If those Hadith are combined together, they give strength. As we give the example of the Hadith regarding that, we gave the example of such Hadith. So that's concerning Hadith. Then I mentioned that the Hadith are said to be maqbool. That's some, I'll give it a general Hadith was said to be maqbool, that you could be defined as, or explain concerning Hadith al-maqbool, that will include Sahih and Hasan. That definition will cover both categories they mention. Who al-Hadith is a Hadith alladhi yattasil isnadu, a Hadith that have a connected, complete isnad, bin-naqlin ad, tam adapt, where the narrators are said to be of complete, of the high rank in their memory, and credible, or qasir anhu, or they have some weakness, slight weakness in their memory. إذا اعتدل and misli, or yanjabar, if they are aided, supported by one which is higher than them or like them until the end. ولا يكون شاذ ولا مؤلل, and the hadith is not said to be shadh or not mu'allal. That's concerned to be that they said with this definition it will include, it becomes inclusive of hadith which is sahih and hadith with hasan. Sahih tam ad-dabt, and hasan qasir ad-dabt or khafif ad-dabt. So if that exists, then the hadith is said to be hasan or sahih. So that inshallah ta'ala are some of the points that they discussed regarding hadith al-hasan. As for those who will discuss regarding concerning hadith said to be shadid al-daf. So we're discussing concerning hadith daif. When hadith is said to be, that will be the next category to be discussed. Hadith are said to be daf, hadith daif, and what comes with regarding making a distinction regarding hadith was said to be shadid al-daf, a very intense, severe weakness, and that which is daf al-yasir, and those hadith said to be it is weak but it is a slight weakness. In that discussion of hadith daif, we'll have that discussion to make that distinction. So this inshallah ta'ala will end the discussion regarding hadith al-hasan. So we have covered regarding the definition linguistically and also istilahan, and as we had mentioned that amongst the ulama of hadith, the definition of hadith sahih, you have various definitions that are given, most of whom are somewhat there's some back and forth regarding those definitions, but the ones that are more popular and been now the established one is the one of Ibn Hajar, and also close to Ibn Hajar definition is that of Shamunni, Taqiyuddin al-Shamunni. That is definition, that those ones that are one that are more so Ibn Hajar is the standard that is used today, but even though some may critique it, but all others definition are critique. Then also we mentioned that hadith al-hasan is said to be maqbool, its condition are said to be at times 5 or 6. 5 as that of hadith sahih except in adapt, but in 6 condition where there's weakness, so it needs something to ya'dilu, something yanjabar, something to aid it. That will be an additional, so there's weakness but something to aid it. That will be an additional condition for hadith al-hasan. Then also we discussed concern that of the ulama who can somewhat, the use of the ulama of hadith al-hasan at times given a meaning istilahan, and also at times meaning that is either linguistically or other than this. It goes back to the person, see what context the word hasan is being used, to have an understanding as to what meaning is intended. Also regarding some of the sources, the books of Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, of those who made Hadith al-Hasan more popular, that they mention that it is At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah ta'ala in his book Al-Jami'. And also we have mentioned that it's also a form of hujjah, a proof regarding in relation to matters of Aqidah. So Hadith al-Hasan is just as a proof as Hadith al-Sahih in matters of Aqidah, in matters of fiqh, in matters of suluk wal akhlaq. It's used regarding any matter of Islam. So that inshallah ta'ala will end this discussion and continue. Wa billahi ta'ala tawfiq wa hadi ila sabil wal akhir wa alhamdulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.